Welcome to OKOGA Live. This is Chad Warmington, president of the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association, alongside you're becoming a regular guest.
It certainly feels like it.
It's supposed to be special, but
certainly feels like
now you're just a regular. That means you're going to want more pay, probably.
Pretty much.
All right. Well, we'll have to work on that. We'll get back to you.
Okay.
But Zack, our vice president of government affairs, our head lobbyist at the Capitol. Interesting week at the Capitol, probably unlike many we've seen before. And so some resolution on some things, and then also, amazingly enough, there was actually some legislation that got through and made it. So kind of give us kind of your synopsis on the week.
Yeah, so last week we were able to pass House Bill 2775 through the Senate, which had already passed through the House. And so this week, this Monday, the governor signed that piece of legislation. That's our Production Revenue Standards Act reform bill. That takes the 6% rate on unmarketable title to the prime interest rate as shown by the Wall Street Journal, which I think is around 4.75% at this point. So that was nice that we were able to get something through the legislature at this point.
Yeah, and I had a conversation last night with one of our members, and they were really emphasizing how big a deal that piece of legislation was, and it was going to be $1 million plus a benefit to them, and really got to give some credit to our friends with the mineral owners, and particularly Terry Stowers with the Coalition of Surface and Mineral Owners, who realized that the loophole essentially needed to be closed, and I appreciate them working with us on that, and we wouldn't have got it done without them.
No, they were great to work together, and then OIPA also supported the measure, so it was nice to have some compromise out there.
No doubt. So good piece of legislation that was a nice way to offset the massive tax hike we got this session. So it didn't offset it, but it sure didn't hurt. So that's a good thing. Anything else that was key for us that wasn't directly related to our other topic we'll talk about, which is the teachers and education?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we're going to want to hit on this week is that it was filing deadline. So we saw Wednesday was the first day of filing, and then today, this Friday at 5 p.m. is going to be the end of filing. We've already seen a record number of candidates file, according to the state election board. Their records only date back to about 2000, but we've already seen around 600 candidates filed just in the first 2 days, and I think that is about where they were in all 3 days, given the past few years.
Right, yeah.
So we've seen a groundswell of interest, not just on statewide elections, but even gubernatorial and lieutenant gubernatorial and things like that.
Yeah, we're losing a couple of incumbents that have been really fantastic legislators, not just pro-oil and gas, but just fantastic pro-growth conservatives. Top of the mind comes to Tim Downing, who's been just a real stalwart of kind of conservative principles and really consistent. And I think that's what everyone's looking for out of the legislators, just consistency. And so any others that jump out to you that we know that aren't coming back?
Yeah, we know that Representative Cockcroft isn't coming back. He was chairman of the Rules Committee, and then he also led the special committee for some investigations and things like that.
Did a really solid job on the special committee as well.
And he was in House leadership, and I think he's got a family at home, and it just became such a burden. It made it really difficult for him to look after his kids and his wife and things like that when you're dealing with the legislature. I think one of the things that people talk about is that it's a part-time job, and what we've seen over the past few years is it really isn't, with special session and investigations like that.
That's right.
So we've seen him, and then we've also seen some representatives that announced early that they weren't going to run again, like Roger Ford, Pat Ownby. I don't think that Representative Dennis Casey is going to be running again.
Rick West.
And Rick West just announced yesterday that he won't be running. Yeah. And so there's probably going to be some today that we see that don't file that didn't really make an announcement as well.
Yeah, and I think what more so than losing obviously good folks that we like working with, you lose a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge about how the Capitol works. And I think it's one of the things that we're really probably struggling with as a state is kind of these lingering after effects of term limits. And I think we all used to think that it was a really good idea. Let's get those new guys out. Let's get those old guys out, the new guys in. We'll have new ideas. But really, it's just like any business and a lot of our members. You want people who have experience doing this process and have been through the ups and downs. And those people are all walking out the door, so we'll probably have more than half the legislature be new next year?
Yeah, it'll be right around there, but I think that one of the more important things that that hasn't been talked about as much, just with all the people not announcing, is the gubernatorial race.
Yeah.
Mary Fallon is term limited, so she won't be back next year. And so whoever is at the top, there will be a different pace of leadership, which I think that the legislature is craving. Either way, they're looking for some direction.
Right, no doubt about that. And I think we'll definitely be seeing a new governor with a whole lot of new legislators, and it's going to be a feeling out learning process. So we'll see how it goes. I think it's going to be a challenge in any way, regardless of the kind of the outcomes of all those elections.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we did this week that was really interesting is we sent a crew to the Capitol. As you know, the ongoing teacher walkout.
Right.
Be sure to can't call it a strike. It's not a strike, right?
Not at this point.
It's a walkout. And, we really wanted to know, what some of the issues that teachers were thinking about as it related to oil and gas. And so we sent a crew to the Capitol, and we asked them some questions and said, hey, if you could ask us questions about the education policy or oil and gas, what would it be? And so we've got a couple of them here for you. We'll take the first one right now.
So my question would be, what would be your solution to a compromise with possibly doing a combination of capital gains and wind tax?
Jason, that's a great question. Essentially what he's asking is what compromise could include capital gains and wind tax. And so I think what we'll do is I'll take a stab at this first and we'll let you chime in. But, Jason, I think it's a great question. I think capital gains became very difficult for the legislature to pass. It was a pretty broad-based tax increase that a lot of groups were opposed to, and it became very difficult. And I think what we've learned from House leadership was that it was the compromise in order to get the taxes for the gross production tax, the votes, for the gross production tax. So I don't think that you are ever going to really see any movement on that. I think the wind tax is still an absolute possibility. And we'll maybe potentially see that. And I think there's been some movement and maybe some legislation that's out there on that.
Yeah, I don't think we've seen legislation necessarily on a wind tax. I think when you look at the wind tax, that would be a 76-vote measure, meaning that you would require Democrats to support it.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know if that's where they're at this point. But outside of a wind tax, there's been proposals about a wind cap, either a soft cap, which would essentially still have the full payment. It would just delay it over a long time, or a hard cap, which would just limit it to around $35 million each year, and then at the end of the 10-year period, that would be it. So there has been discussion around that. However, it appears that those are going to be moving through the process, and it won't happen anytime soon.
So real quick, because you did a good job of explaining this yesterday, I heard you explain it, in that soft cap versus hard cap, essentially you were talking hundreds of millions of dollars of difference. And so give us a little detail. The hard cap basically eliminates that overhead, correct?
Right. So the Oklahoma Tax Commission, they've said that there's around $500 to $750 million worth of zero emissions refundable wind tax credits out there on the books. So a soft cap, what that would essentially do is you would be paid out $35 million pro rata to all the companies, however they get it, each year. But you would still be paid out the full $500 to $750 million until that $35 million is paid out. So those payments could be going on for the next 40 years or so, however long it takes. Now the hard cap, you would just be paying out $35 million. It would go pro rata as well. And then that would end after the 10 years is up on the zero emission refundable side.
So in that case, you'd pay out $350 million of the outstanding credits, and at the end, that's it. Okay. I know that the wind industry has threatened some lawsuits on that, and that kind of have its own legal journey to go on, but I think it is being discussed, and more importantly, as you alluded to, that's a 51 vote measure, so it's easier to pass, correct?
Yes, that's most definitely correct. When you look at the wind tax, it takes Democratic support, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to get through.
Great. Jason, thank you for taking the time to ask the question. Let's go to our next question as well.
And we want to know what oil and gas production can do for educational funding, not just for teacher pay raises, but for support staff, and we want to make sure that there is money put back into the classrooms.
Rissa, thank you for the question, and I think it's a good one. Essentially, the question is, what can oil and gas do to increase education funding and not just teacher pay? And I think that's one of the kind of the big stories of the week was the shift away from teacher pay to education funding. And so, as you know, teacher pay was increased significantly before the teacher walkout even happened. The legislature voted on it the week before the walkout happened, a significant historic pay raise of an average of about $6,000. And that was funded almost entirely, 50% of it, with the only 50% of it was reoccurring revenue, which is oil and gas revenue, but it's very unstable revenue. And so what we've been saying and what we've been concerned about is that revenue source is a pretty volatile revenue source for teachers, and it's something that, frankly, the legislature really shouldn't have done. And Frank, you've made us more dependent on us being Oklahoma, more dependent on that really volatile source of revenue. That's a concern for us. I think what we could have done for overall education funding was what the step-up plan was all about, and that's why we supported it. Our board took a look at it, and it was a much broader, it was more revenue and broader across a wider swath of revenue collection, and so it didn't make the state so much more dependent on gross production tax. And so what we could have done, had the Democrats voted for it, is we could have had a significant bigger revenue base in order to be able to guarantee teacher pay and education funding with a broader base of revenue that would have a potential to be more recurring. That's what we could have done. I don't think we can put that genie back in the bottle. The Democrats didn't want to do it. The legislature has chosen to go this other direction, raise the tax higher on gross production than what was proposed in Step Up, and cut all the other taxes. So it's really a bad policy move. I mean, they reduced all the benefits of spreading it out and then made it even more dependent on the volatile source of revenue that's oil and gas. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a revisionist history, but if we look back at the step-up package, it was going to bring in more money than what they've done this year, and they were also going to be able to save some funds to put forward to next year. So I think that one of the frustrating things when you look at this package, the way that they've done it, is they've raised all this money, and they've even spent more money than they've raised. So I think the real concern is if there is another economic downturn, we're going to be right back to where we're at. And that's not where the state needs to be. That's not where education funding needs to be. So that's just one of the things that we're going to have to look out for and try and protect those funds.
Yeah, I mean, they did the inevitable, or the thing that they kind of fall back to, which is kicking the can down the road. I'd argue, though, they kicked the full can down the road, but they only kicked 3/4 of the funding down the road. So we could be right back in a pretty tough situation again in 2 years,
right?
3 years, whenever the next dip happens, really. Anyway, thanks again for your question. Let's take the next one.
Hi, my name is Paula Morrow. I'm a librarian at Taft Middle School in Oklahoma City. And my question is there anything else, any more money that the oil and gas industry can contribute to education? We would appreciate it.
Hey, Paul, I think that's probably a very broad question that a lot of teachers think about, is what else can oil and gas do? And I'd argue that there's tons more we can do if the policies of the state are set up conducive and the tax system set up for us to be really aggressive in drilling new wells here. Because, as the Oklahoma oil and gas industry goes, so goes the Oklahoma economy. And also, now that teacher pay is directly tied to the success of the economy, teachers really ought to be, champions of the oil and gas industry and making sure that the policies in place in the state are really maximizing the development of that. But I would argue, Paula, that oil and gas does a ton in communities all across the state. And I think that's one of the things we found from walking around at the Capitol. There's a lot of support for oil and gas. They see the STEM education programs that we do. They see the donations that companies make privately to schools, that our employees spend time in schools helping and mentoring and coaching. And those are all things that are only possible when the oil and gas industry is healthy and when there's a lot of employment and tax revenue to go around. Just 3 years ago, the oil and gas industry lost 20,000 workers that got laid off due to the downturn. And those are workers who would have been able to contribute in their community, not only through the tax base, but also through their volunteer efforts, too. So, Paul, it's a fair question, but I think when you look at 25% of all state revenue being generated from the oil and gas industry, and a very significant portion of total education funding coming directly from oil and gas, and I don't know if you knew this, Paula, but the way that the gross production tax works on oil, the first $150 million of gross production tax goes straight into the 1017 funds that's only spent on education. That's before any other part of government gets the money. The first $150 million goes straight to education. So I'd argue we do plenty. We can do more if the environment is right and our member companies are able to drill and able to produce oil and natural gas. But I also want to argue, Paula, I want us to be thoughtful about not being too dependent on us.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you mentioned early on is the tax code. And that's the whole argument that's been framed around teacher education, has been raising taxes. I think when you look at oil and gas's tax code, there's no more credits. There's no exemptions really, and so we just have a flat. Now we have a flat 5% rate for 36 months to 7%. So when you look at that, I mean, we've essentially done what we're going to do tax-wise. Now, I think talking about member companies and what they can do in communities is, I think, a great idea, and I think that's something that they're already doing.
Right.
And I think it's effective. But.
Yeah. And I'd ask this, Paul. I'd say, what would you like to see in the schools that you're working at? How could the oil and gas industry be helpful to you? We'd love to see and hear some ideas on ways that we could engage it. I think our member companies are looking for ways to do that. And so help us identify the needs. That would be super helpful. Appreciate the question. Last question we have is coming up right here.
I'm an educator here in Oklahoma, and I'm just wondering, out of curiosity, does the oil and gas industry ever feel that with green energy kind of being the hot topic and things right now, do they ever feel that things like wind energy and those things that you would term green energy are ever given preferential treatment or maybe taxed at a more favorable rate, just because it is kind of the current hot trend right now in energy talk?
Another great question, Ryan. I think I'd summarize this one by saying, does green energy get preferential tax treatment? Unequivocally, yes, they do. Look, the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association, our board, has spent a lot of time being very careful about how we talk about wind energy and the preferential tax treatment it gets. And I think maybe in retrospect, maybe that wasn't such a great idea to be so kind of introspective about it, and also try not to lay a bunch of burden at their feet. But absolutely, wind energy gets preferential tax treatment in Oklahoma. The wind energy folks have run ads, and they keep talking about this huge ad valorem tax base they pay, and they pay more than any other industry. That's just not accurate. It's not even remotely close. If you look at really the total amount that they pay, it's not even comparison. It's an ant hill and an elephant compared to the tax base in terms of what the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association, the industry pays. But really, when you look at the taxes that they do, quote unquote, pay, most, or I guess it's 78% or somewhere around 78% of all the turbines in the state had a 5-year ad valorem exemption. So the tax dollars that are going into those communities, and those are good tax dollars, let me be clear. Communities that have wind farms, they love them, and their education system love them. But that money is actually being paid by you, the taxpayer. You actually have a 5 years worth of ad valorem tax exemption that the state of Oklahoma writes a check back to the county for the ad valorem dollars that would have been paid by those wind farms. And I'm not criticizing the wind companies for taking them. Absolutely, the state offered it, you should have taken it. But let's be clear about that. Your tax burden isn't very big because what you actually pay is only after 5 years, and by that time, the state has already been on the hook for the hundreds of millions of dollars in ad valorem exemptions. And so, it's just funny to see these commercials talking about how big a tax base they have and how much they pay, when the reality is Oklahoma taxpayers are paying for that. Again, not criticizing them. It was offered by the state, and they took advantage of it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think some of the things that you mentioned, so ad valorem reimbursement. So let's just talk a little bit about that. What you mean is that these wind turbines, they were able to come in, and for the first 5 years, the state was paying the ad valorem that the wind companies should be paying. They've ended that credit. However, there still are some companies that are on the rolls for that. So what we saw this past year is, I think there was about $80 million worth of ad valorem reimbursement that the state had to pay. I think it got to be about $67 million of that was from wind companies. So essentially the state was paying that $67 million for the wind companies.
Yeah.
I think one of the other things you mentioned was the zero emission tax credit, the zero emission refundable tax credit. So with that tax credit, we already mentioned that there's about $500 to $750 million worth of tax credit liability out there. Because it's refundable, not only can the companies write off their corporate income tax structure, they can just write that off because they've got the credits. They can also receive money from the state. So that's two ways that, one is the state is paying for it, and then two, the state is also sending them a check. And so that's when the question of, is there a preferential tax treatment? Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't say, well, our friends from the wind industry always pivot back and go, well, you guys don't pay ad valorem. And that couldn't be further from the truth. We absolutely do have an exemption on ad valorem on the minerals in the ground. We're not paying a tax on that. We pay the gross production tax in lieu of that. And then we have an ad valorem exemption on the equipment used essentially to get those minerals to the surface. But every other part of the equipment, the midstreams, the pipelines, the gathering systems, ask one of our midstream companies if they have any ad valorem base. They pay literally hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes on that equipment that's not exempt. Every building that's owned by an oil and gas company throughout the state is paid taxes on. So there is sure an exemption on some portion of the collection of the equipment that collects the minerals, and not on the minerals themselves. But our ad valorem base for the oil and gas industry is massive in the state. So to say that we have an exemption and don't pay it isn't accurate. And again, I'm not saying that they're incorrect in saying we have it. We do. But let's be real about what the amounts are. And so there is, without question, a preferential tax treatment that was given by the legislature, and we should not fault the companies that came and took it. But it's time to reevaluate that, and the legislature has. And I think that they are moving to continue to reevaluate that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. Those are going to be ongoing conversations with the legislature.
So Ryan, again, thank you for your question and for taking the time to ask it. So I think it was a really interesting exercise. James, who went out from OKOGA, said he talked to 60, 70 people, and there was a general sentiment that they were appreciative of the oil and gas industry and not a lot of criticism about our tax base or our taxes, and there wasn't really a whole lot of talk about increasing gross production tax. And again, I think I'll wrap up with this and leave you with the last word is we are now tied more than ever, teachers, together. Our success is your success. Gross production tax has been used to fund your pay raise. And so you want us to do well. You want the oil and gas industry here and thriving for all the other reasons we know it benefit, but specifically to benefit you in terms of your potential for the raises to be paid for. And so we need to work together, and we can make Oklahoma a great place to be and win a healthy oil and gas industry and a healthy education system. This is going to be a pretty phenomenal state to live in, so let's do that together. Any other last thoughts?
No, I would completely agree with that, and I think we look forward to those conversations. I mean, we are fully supportive of teacher pay raises, and we are fully supportive of education. So, I mean, we're excited about some of the things that are happening.
Well said. We'll leave it at that. We'll look forward to joining you next week. We've got a couple of great guests lined up for the next couple of OKOGA Lives, and we will see you then.